idea.
Let's get that blood flowing. We don't want anyone to be stressed out this afternoon. Why don't we have some prayer together? Talk to Jesus for just a moment. Again, Doc, thank you so much for sharing your gifts with us. Let's talk to the Lord for a minute. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this opportunity to come together for a few moments this afternoon. Thank you for Pam and she sharing these different bits of very important information. We pray that we can leave this place this afternoon with tools to be able to implement the principles of Scripture that she's sharing with us, the science, the blend of these things, that we could leave this place better equipped personally and to be able to help others with these things. Thank you for continuing with us for the rest of this workshop. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Please be seated.
Thank you. Thank you. So before we move on to the sixth stress-reducing belief, am I on, Mike? Okay. Before we move on to the sixth stress-reducing belief, I wanted to tell you a quick story. I told you that my stepdad, Pastor McCarty, developed the idea of the gratitude zone. And the first time that he actually got to test this theory out for himself was when he first developed his stress management materials, and he and my mom went to a health conference to present this material for the first time. And this was way back in the day. This was the day before PowerPoint existed. So my mom came along so that she could help him change slides for the presentation. And the health conference was for about 30 health professionals that they were all going to take classes in what Skip had developed. And then at the end of the week of this health conference, they would be certified to teach the same stress management materials themselves. Well, the conference was being held in San Diego. And the event coordinator came to my stepdad after the first day, and he said, there has been a request made by the health professionals that we make some of your sessions optional because we're here in San Diego and we're surrounded by nice parks and they want to get outside and enjoy some of the things that San Diego offers. And my stepdad, without really hesitating or thinking about it, he said, oh yeah, sure, that's fine, just make them optional. My mom was not pleased with him for that because she works on commission. She's in a business where you make commission as your main form of income, and she said, well, I gave up a whole week of commission in order to come out here and switch slides out for you, so are you sure you want to make this decision? So she and my stepdad kind of had to have a conference of themselves about this and decide what they were going to do. And what they decided is that they were going to try to zero out their expectations of what was going to happen at this conference. And zero expectations or low expectations for them meant that 3 people would show up to each session. 2 of those people would be my stepdad and my mom, so they only had to have 1 other person attend for their expectations to have been met. So the first afternoon, after it was announced that all of these sessions were going to be optional, they were sitting there in the room waiting for someone to show up, and finally someone did, and then another person showed up, and another person showed up. So eventually it got to the point where their expectations were exceeded, and anything beyond their low expectation they just took as gratitude. They were just grateful that other people attended. Well, it turned out okay in their case because of the 30 health professionals that were there, the vast majority of them ended up coming to every single session. All right, now let's move on to the 6th stress-reducing belief, which is placing everything that happens to us in perspective. So what would happen, or how would our emotional reaction be different if we filtered everything that happens to us through the belief that hard times are always eased when I place them in proper perspective? So oftentimes what stress management professionals do is they use a scale of some sort. And the scale can change. You can use a scale from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, doesn't really matter. But you have some sort of scale where the bottom end of the scale represents no stress or little stress. And then at the top end of the scale would be severe stress. And then you rate the problem that you're dealing with along that scale. So I mentioned early on one of the cognitive distortions that we face sometimes is catastrophizing, meaning we think that something that we're going through is a lot worse than it actually is. So it helps to rate our problem with a very minor irritant being a 1, and the worst thing that we could possibly imagine happening, such as getting word that we have 1 week to live, rating a 10. And if we rate a traffic jam an 8 along that scale, chances are we are catastrophizing that problem. We're making a lot worse than it actually is. So I'd like you, if you are connected to the polling service that I have, I'd like you to get out your phones, because I'm going to have you think about a problem that you might be facing right now, and where would you put that problem realistically along this stress scale? So when the poll comes up, what you're going to do is 1 would be A, 2 would be B, 3 would be C, and so on. So rate it along this stress scale, and let's see where everybody stands. Oh, looks like we already have some answers. So most people are at a low level of stress. That's pretty good. I mean, some of us, of course, are going to deal with catastrophic things that happens to us, and those things do happen. But it helps to put the problems that we have along this stress scale, to put them into proper perspective. Okay, awesome. Before we move on to the next one, I just wanted to share with you that once you learn some of these stress-reducing beliefs, they kind of pop out at you wherever you go and whatever you're doing. So you find these stress-reducing beliefs everywhere you look. And one place that you actually can find them are in children's books. So I'm going to take a chance and see if you guys are going to continue to be interactive for me. This book is called Too Much Noise by Anne McGovern. And let's read this book together. It won't take very long. A long time ago, there was an old man. Should I get closer? If I get closer, the camera's not going to be able to pick me up. But that's okay. They can still hear me. A long time ago, there was an old man. His name was Peter, and he lived in an old, old house. The bed creaked. The floor squeaked. Outside, the wind blew the leaves through the trees. The leaves fell on the roof. Swish, swish. The tea kettle whistled. Hiss, hiss. Too noisy, said Peter. Peter went to see the wise man of the village. What can I do? Peter asked the wise man. My house makes too much noise. My bed creaks. My floor squeaks. The wind blows the leaves through the trees. The leaves fall on the roof. Swish, swish. My tea kettle whistles. Hiss, hiss. Oh, sorry. You guys see the wise man? There's the wise man. Okay. I can help you, the wise man said. I know what you can do. What? Said Peter. Get a cow, said the wise man. What good is a cow? Said Peter. But Peter got a cow anyhow. The cow said, moo, moo. The bed creaked, the floor squeaked, the leaves fell on the roof, swish, swish. The tea kettle whistled, hiss, hiss. Too noisy, said Peter, and he went back to the wise man. Get a donkey, said the wise man. What good is a donkey, said Peter, but Peter got a donkey anyhow. The donkey said, hee-haw. The cow said, moo, moo. See, if I was really asking to be interactive, you guys would have to make the animal sounds. And I have done that before, so had the attitude of gratitude that I'm not. The bed creaked, the floor squeaked, the leaves fell on the roof. Swish, swish, the tea kettle whistled, hiss, hiss. Still too noisy, said Peter. And he went back to the wise man. Get a sheep, said the wise man. What good is a sheep, said Peter. But Peter got a sheep anyhow. The sheep said, ba, ba. The donkey said, hee-haw. The cow said, moo, moo. The bed creaked. The floor squeaked. The leaves fell on the roof. Swish, swish. The tea kettle whistled. Hiss, hiss. Do you see where he's going with this whole thing? All right, so we can flip through some of the pages. He gets a hen. He gets a dog, a cat. He gets a... Oh, okay, all right, so I guess that's all he gets. He gets a dog. The dog says woof, woof. The cat says meow. The hen says cluck, cluck. The sheep says ba, ba. The donkey says hee haw. The cow says moo, moo. The bed creaked. The floor squeaked. The leaves fell on the roof. Swish, swish. The tea kettle whistled. Hiss, hiss. Yeah. Now Peter was angry. He went to the wise man. I told you my house was too noisy, he said. I told you my bed creaks, my floor squeaks, the leaves fall on the roof, the tea kettle whistles. You told me to get a cow. All day the cow says moo. You told me to get a donkey. All day the cow says hee haw. You told me to get a sheep. All day long the sheep says ba, ba. You told me to get a hen. All day long the hen says cluck, cluck. You told me to get a dog and a cat, and all day long the dog says woof, woof, and all day the cat says meow. I'm going crazy, said Peter. The wise man said, do what I tell you. Let the cow go, let the donkey go, let the sheep go, let the hen go, let the dog go, let the cat go. So Peter let the cow go, he let the donkey go, he let the sheep go, he let the hen go, he let the dog go, he let the cat go. All right, I'll skip the no sound. The bed creaked. Ah, said Peter, what a quiet noise. The floor squeaked. Oh, said Peter, what a quiet noise. Outside, the leaves fell on the roof. Swish, swish. Inside, the tea kettle whistled. Hiss, hiss. Ah, said Peter, how quiet my house is. And Peter got into his bed and went to sleep and dreamed a very quiet dream. Learning how to put things into perspective. The seventh stress-reducing belief is accepting that every event in our life can have some meaning. And this doesn't mean that things have an inherent meaning, but it means that we can create or derive meaning out of everything that happens to us. When tragic things happen, like we were talking about this morning, I think there are three things about those situations that at least I think about. The first is that God hates that kind of suffering every bit as much as we do. The second thing that I think about is God is not going to allow that kind of suffering any longer than he has to. And the third thing that I think about is where God wants to be in those situations. I don't necessarily think that God wants to be above us and trickling suffering into individual lives, saying, well, you're strong, you can handle more stress, or you can handle more suffering than this person. I don't actually think that that's the position that God wants to be in. I think where he wants to be when we are dealing with tragedy and suffering is he wants to be beside us, helping us through it. And I think the reason why he wants to be beside us is so that he can show us that there's something ahead of us, that there's a purpose and a hope and a plan that he has for us. So he can whisper in our ear, you see that up there? I can get you to that point from where you are now. I think this is the point of the Bible verse. And we know in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. How would our emotional reaction be different if we filtered those tragic events, that suffering, through the belief that God can use every situation and any situation to accomplish something good? Dr. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who was actually put into the concentration camp at Auschwitz. And after he came out of the camp, he developed a whole new form of psychotherapy called logotherapy. One of the centerpieces of that form of therapy is the purpose that suffering can have in our lives. And he wrote the following in his book, The Man's Search for Meaning. There is nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is meaning in one's life. Let me cite a clear-cut example. Once, an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before and whom he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What should I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the question, what would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you? Oh, he said, for her this would have been terrible, how she would have suffered. Whereupon I replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it is you who have spared her this suffering. But now you have to pay for it by surviving and mourning her. He said no word, but shook my hand and calmly left my office. Suffering ceases to be suffering in some way at the moment it finds a meaning. Another story comes from a book called Growing Through Stress by Kath Donovan. She wrote, when a friend of mine was killed in the Granville train disaster at the height of a fruitful ministry, his wife began a ministry to other widows. Such overflow ministry does not take away the pain, but gives meaning to it. It is meaningless pain which can't be endured. Trust believes there is a meaning even though it is impossible at that time to see what it is. In the story that I told you earlier of Gary Mendel and his wife who lost their son, Brian, due to a drug overdose, the meaning that they derived, that they created out of that tragic experience was to develop their own ministry, their own nonprofit organization to help other families avert the same tragic circumstances. Ellen White wrote, to all who are reaching out to feel the guiding hand of God, the moment of greatest discouragement is the time when divine help is nearest. They will look back with thankfulness upon the darkest part of their way. The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly. From every temptation and every trial, he will bring them forth with firmer faith and a richer experience. The belief that God works through, though not necessarily causes all of the events of our lives, can transform sources of stress into sources of personal growth. The eighth stress-reducing belief is yielding personal rights to God and accepting them back as gifts at his discretion. And we should be careful here to define what these rights are. I'm not talking here about human rights. So let's define human rights as anything that would protect our fellow man from experiencing loss of safety, loss of dignity. When we protect human rights, that means that we are protecting other people from losing those things, from losing dignity or safety or respect. What we're talking here are personal rights, things that are changeable and maybe where my standard of that right is different than your standard. So I hesitate here to use any specific example, but I will use a couple. For human rights, we know that the civil rights movement, of course, of the 60s was a good example of protecting human rights. Personal rights, there are some stories that I read, some news articles where I wonder how people come up with standards that are so different from what I would consider my standards to be. So, for example, there are some news articles that I just read in the past couple weeks of brides who are planning their wedding ceremony, and one bride was just up in arms, just outraged that one of her bridesmaids had gotten a haircut that was different than any of the other bridesmaids. So for me, this would suggest that maybe she has a standard that would be different than mine, because I would be in the same situation and think, what's the big deal? I don't care if you have a different haircut. But we should be careful not to criticize other people, because we all have these standards. We may not even realize that we have these standards, but we do. So I'll tell you something that just happened this week to me. When I was preparing for this weekend, you know, Oleg and I also teach a Sabbath school class downstairs, and Oleg asked me early in the week, so when do you want to get together and plan for Sabbath school? And immediately, a personal right kicked in to me. So I was thinking, well, I have a lot of stuff to prepare for anyway. I'm not going to prepare for Sabbath school. You do that part. And then I thought, wait, I'm just assuming that Oleg is going to be in charge of that, and I'm not going to have anything to do with that. And I never asked him if that was going to be the case. So instead of asserting a right, a personal right of mine, I said, this was my understanding of how this was going to go down this weekend. Is that okay with you? Is that what I said, honey? Maybe I was a little bit stronger than that. I'm sorry. But that was my intention. So thank you, honey. So we all have these personal rights that sometimes we feel are violated, and it's a personal thing. It's a standard that I have that maybe no one else does. And those are the kind of rights that I feel are, if we want to decrease the stress in our lives, we will yield those rights to God, and at his discretion, we will receive them back as gifts. So what would be different about our circumstances if we accept our personal rights as gifts, not entitlements? Would this then present a new pathway of gratitude and joy? So anything that we get out of life that we were not expecting to get is a new window of gratitude, right? It's a new avenue whereby we can obtain more happiness of grace. And that's basically what we're trying to do here. Yielding any personal rights is going to automatically provide more opportunities for us to be grateful and experience the happiness of grace. Defending personal rights often leads to conflict and stress. We live, I think, in a time where people are very adamant about asserting rights. And sometimes they're adamant about asserting human rights, but oftentimes they're also adamant about asserting their personal rights as well. And that may or may not be good, depending on the circumstances. But what I do know is we also live in a time where there's a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety and depression, and I don't think that's coincidental. Here's one example of a personal right that was talked about in this book by Paul Tournier. He's a psychiatrist, and he wrote this book where he said, "Early one Sunday morning, my wife asked me to take out the dog. I did so, but I was protesting inwardly. My protest was the assertion of my right to sleep in on a Sunday morning. There was also self-pity at having to get up. I went back to bed with these negative thoughts turning over in my mind. The result, I found it impossible to go back to sleep. And the fact that I could not get back to sleep again encouraged my negative thoughts and complaints." So basically what he was doing is he was filtering that circumstance through a stress-inducing belief. He was saying, it's my right to sleep in on Sunday mornings. I deserve it. No one has the right to wake me up. And that then led to the emotional consequence of frustration and annoyance at his wife. All at once I realized that what was stopping me from sleeping was not my morning walk, but the complaining thoughts about it that I had allowed to develop in my mind. I saw that I should have got back to sleep long before if my inward complaints had not kept sleep at bay, that I was the victim of my own attitude and not of circumstances. I went to sleep again at once. So how do we yield our rights? What process should we take? Well, the first thing that we should do is identify these personal rights that we have, that we all have, that we may not even realize we have. How do I identify them? Well, conflict is often an indicator. So if we are in conflict with someone, maybe we should look for and identify some personal right that I have or the other person has that they feel is being violated in some way. Then the next step would be to yield these rights to God. And the way you could simply do that is to say, God, I want you to take this right away from me so that it's not going to interfere in this relationship anymore. And then you accept those rights back as gifts at God's discretion. He can take them, he can give them back, but it's his choice. The other important part about this is to distinguish between rights and responsibilities, because we don't want to say that we should ever yield our responsibilities. So what kinds of personal responsibilities do we all have? We have a personal responsibility to always live by our spiritual values. So if anyone is ever asking you to compromise on that, of course you're not going to yield that right or that responsibility. You also have the responsibility to take care of yourself in a physical way, in a mental way, in a spiritual way. So if anyone is ever asking you to yield, like if your boss is asking you to work late every night for months at a time, that's something that you need to assert and say, I have the responsibility to take care of myself. We have the responsibility to protect other people's rights. So again, if there's a situation where we need to defend other people's safety and respect and dignity, then we should do that. We have the personal responsibility to live by the golden rule, to do unto others as they would do unto us. We have the responsibility of caring for our family. We always have the responsibility of fulfilling our commitments, or if we feel like we can't fulfill them, to adjust them as necessary. Fulfilling responsibilities creates the positive kind of stress, the eustress. Fulfilling our responsibilities is one way of achieving the happiness of excellence. These are the personal rights that I'm talking about. Always feeling like we need to be treated fairly according to my standard, which you may or may not know about. Always being loved and respected. Well, I can't always control how other people are going to feel about me. So if I insist that everyone in the world loves me, I'm setting myself up for stress. Insisting that I have a long life, or insisting that other people in my family have a long life. If I consider that a personal right, then I'm completely ignoring the fact that a lot of other people have died at a younger age than I am now. And if I found out tomorrow that I'm suffering from a terminal illness, I have a choice at that point. I can either decide to live the rest of the days that I have in gratitude for those days, grateful for every day that God chooses to give me, or I can choose to be bitter that my life has been cut that short. It's my choice. Personal rights would be treated as I want to be treated. We are always responsible for treating others the way we would like to be treated, but we can't always control how other people treat us. And others always keeping their commitments to me, that's kind of the same thing. So when we insist on these rights, we develop distress, the negative kind of stress, but yielding these rights to God prevents emotional distress. Okay, we're almost done. 2 more stress-reducing beliefs, and then I'm going to tell you a story that combines all of them together. The 9th stress-reducing belief is forgiveness. I will forgive those who hurt me, refusing to harbor the destructive spirit of resentment, bitterness, and revenge. Would our life be different? Would our circumstances be different if we filtered difficult situations and conflict through the belief that forgiveness sets all my relationships and me free? This is a biblical principle, as we know. In Colossians, Paul wrote, "Therefore, as God-chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you." There's a book that I really like a lot by Chip Tafrady and Howard Casanova. I think I referenced it at another sermon that I gave last fall. And in this book, it's actually on anger management, but it's got a chapter on forgiveness in it. And they go through a 5-step process of forgiveness, but the bottom line is the 2 components of forgiveness, psychologically speaking, is yielding your anger, your negative thoughts toward that person, and the second component is trying to treat them with compassion and understanding. Those are the 2 components psychologically. Biblically, we know that forgiveness is deciding not to condemn someone who has actually done you a wrong, right? That's basically what forgiveness is. The reason why we do that is because we are all in need of that forgiveness. So George Herbert wrote, "He who cannot forgive breaks the bridge over which he must pass himself, for every man has need to be forgiven." C.S. Lewis wrote, "You must make every effort to kill every taste of resentment in your own heart, every wish to humiliate or hurt him, the offender, or pay him out. The difference between this situation and the one in such you are asking God's forgiveness is this. In our own case, we accept excuses too easily. In other people's, we do not accept them easily enough. But even if he, the offender, is absolutely fully to blame, we still have to forgive him. And even if 99% of his apparent guilt can be explained away by really good excuses, the problem of forgiveness begins with the 1% guilt which is left over. To excuse what can really produce good excuses is not Christian character. It is only fairness. To be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. Okay, 10th stress-reducing belief, I will live by the golden rule. What I find fascinating about the golden rule is it seems to be a universally recognized rule, not just in Christianity, but in a lot of other world religions. And it's phrased differently in different world religions, but the thought is the same. So Confucius wrote, "What you do not want one to do to yourself, do not do to others." Hinduism, "This is the sum of duty. Do not unto others which would cause you pain if done to you." Buddhism, "Hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful." Judaism, "What is hateful to yourself, do to no other. That is the entire law. The rest is commentary." And Christianity, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." Would our life be different if every situation of conflict was filtered through the belief, treating others as I would want to be treated is a key to a life of purpose, meaning, and fulfillment? There's both an outward and an inward application to the golden rule because there are two people involved in the process. When we love others as we are supposed to love ourselves, as Jesus said, then there are two people in that process. We love others, but it's implied that we also love ourselves. So we're going to talk about both the outward application, what we extend to others, and the inward application, what we extend to ourselves as part of the golden rule. The outward application is that we choose in all circumstances to believe the best of others. So we ask ourselves questions like, do I really know what this person is thinking, or am I just jumping to my own conclusions? How is the other person seeing the situation? Am I assessing this person's behavior and motives fairly? Am I describing this person fairly, or am I belittling or insulting him or her just to make myself feel better? Would everyone else see this person in the same negative way? Why or why not? How would I want to be treated if I were in the other person's shoes right now? Would I apply the same standards towards someone I really loved or cared about? What would happen if I chose to treat others with compassion and understanding rather than judgment? What would happen if I chose to forgive rather than hold grudges? These are all outward applications of the golden rule, choosing to believe the best of others. Now here's the inward application. I choose to believe the best of myself. Many people, and people who have never experienced depression, don't necessarily understand this, but feelings of worthlessness are one of the most common symptoms of depressed people. So about 80 to 90% of all people with clinical depression have a sense of worthlessness. So choosing to believe the best of myself is kind of a big deal if I'm depressed. And here's some questions that I can ask myself in order to facilitate that process. What would happen if I were to treat myself as a valued and loved friend? What would happen if I were to accept myself as a work in progress rather than a failure? What would happen if I stopped focusing on what I did wrong and started working on what I can do differently in the future? I'll end the golden rule with a story. It's actually about a psychotherapist who went to visit a woman who was suffering from severe clinical depression. She was rather elderly. She was living completely alone. And when this therapist went to see her, she was in her house. Most of the lights were turned off, so it was very dark inside. What this therapist did notice was in the corner there was one of those plant lights that you put over plants you're trying to grow inside your house, and underneath the lights were some pots with some African violets in them. And he asked this woman, he said, "Have you ever considered sharing these beautiful flowers with other people that might be feeling down?" And she didn't really answer him, and he didn't really follow up on it with her. But later on, several years later, he saw a newspaper headline from the town where this woman lived, and it said, "African violent lady dies, mourned by thousands." So apparently she did take him up on his advice, and that's exactly what she did. She was known for bringing African violets to other people who were suffering. And when this therapist was asked later why he gave her that specific advice, she was suffering from depression, so he could have given her lots of pieces of advice. What he said was he felt like it would be easier for him to try to grow the African violet side of her than try to weed out the depression side. So there's something about reaching out to others in love that ends up healing ourselves as well. Okay, we've now gone through all 10 stress-reducing beliefs. I hope that you gain some value from them. I know every time I go through them, I realize that there's some work for me to do. But what we do here is we take when you start feeling frustrated or stressed about something, you get a piece of paper on which you have written all of these stress-reducing beliefs, and you just go down the list. And you filter that thing through every one of these until you start seeing it in a different way, in a more positive way. So to go through them again, the first belief was to accept God as a spiritual parent who values us. And that's going to be the release point of our anxieties and our fears. The second is to live one day at a time. We serve the I am God who's with us in this time. The third is I will live by the serenity prayer. The fourth is I will accept personal responsibility for my happiness. Fifth, I will choose to be grateful. Sixth, I will place everything that happens to me into perspective. Seventh, I will believe that everything that happens can have a meaning. I will yield my personal rights and take them back as gifts. I will forgive wrongs done against me. I will follow the golden rule. So a lot of these are multidimensional, aren't they? They all integrate a positive perspective on life, treating other people with dignity and respect, following the golden rule, so building those supportive relationships, and also taking some biblical principles. This God who knows better than any of us what to do to heal our emotions. He's given us some valuable information in the Bible, and we need to start following it. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you a story, and it's actually a biblical story, of a person who I think was very successful at using all 10 of these stress-reducing beliefs. Joseph. So in the book of Genesis, what's interesting about that book is it kind of takes 2,500 years of Earth's history and combines it down into one book of the Bible. And what's really interesting is, of that particular book, almost a quarter of that book is all dedicated to one man, Joseph. So his story is probably pretty important. We can learn a lot from the story of his life. So we all know the basic outline of the story. Joseph was born into a family. He was a descendant of Abraham. He was the 11th of 12 boys. For a long time, he was the baby of the family, so his dad spoiled him rotten, so his brothers hated him. And when they had the opportunity, they kidnapped him and sold him into slavery, so he was sent down to Egypt. And of course, that time was very different than our time. If you went a few hundred miles down the road, in that time, it was a much bigger deal. It was like going across the world and being kidnapped by the mafia and put somewhere into, human trafficking, human slavery, or something like that. So it was very tragic circumstances for Joseph. But along that journey, it seems like Joseph had to come to some conclusions about his situation. He was going to live from that point forward either in deep distress, or he was going to find a way to live his life in a very positive way. And it seems like he chose the latter. He chose to filter what was happening to him through these stress-reducing beliefs. So here's some examples of what he might have said. I'm responsible for my own emotions. When my ancestors faced difficulties, they still maintained their faith, overcame their circumstances. I'm responsible for my own emotions and happiness. In this stormy time of my life, I can create my own good weather and carry it with me. I will be grateful for what I have. Sure, I've lost a lot, but I'm still alive and young. I still have my faith. They can't take that away from me. I'm going to be grateful for what I have. Help me lower my expectations to the 0 point so that I can be grateful for every bite of food you put on my life's plate. I will put this into perspective. They could be torturing me right now. Instead, I may get a chance to work and help someone, even as a slave. This will be a whole new adventure, challenge, and opportunity. I can trust God with this. I don't understand why this is happening, but I know my God is still with me. I may be a slave, but I know I have value because I'm a child of God, and I will respect these foreigners too, for they too are children of God. Lord, help me to accept what I can't change. Give me the courage to do the things I can each day to make some positive contribution in some way, no matter how bad the circumstances, and give me the wisdom to know the difference between what I should just accept and what I can realistically do something about. Lord, help me live one day at a time. Help me not to torture myself with thoughts of how easy my life used to be. Help me not to worry about what could happen to me in the future. I have this day. Help me use the grace and strength you've given me to make the difference I can make this day. I will give this experience some meaning. Something good is going to come out of this. If nothing else, I can become a better person through all of this. But if I'm faithful to my God and my duties, he can bring something good out of it. I know he can. I will yield my rights. Lord, help me to focus on my responsibilities and to do my best to fulfill whatever duty is assigned to me. If my lot in life is to be a slave until I die, help me be the very best slave I can be, the best my masters ever had. I will follow the golden rule. Lord, help me to always treat others as I would want them to treat me, no matter how they treat me in return. If I can do that through these circumstances, I will have made a success out of my life. Lord, help me forgive my brothers. I'm pretty bitter about what my brothers did to me. In fact, I hated them, but I don't want to ruin my life with resentment. Help me forgive them, Lord. Give me your love for them. They're going to have a lot to live with in their consciences. Be with them. So did Joseph end up forgiving his brothers? We know, right? Because it's actually recorded in the story. Joseph met up with his brothers after he had actually been a slave for a while in Egypt under Potiphar. Potiphar's wife accused him of trying to rape her. He was put into prison. And the thing is about Joseph's story is he had no clue what the end of his own life story was going to be. For all he knew, he could have been a slave or he could have been in prison for the rest of his life. But yet he chose to live by these principles. So in every situation, if you read the story, he rose to the occasion. In Potiphar's household, he was eventually put under Potiphar himself and was the manager of his whole estate. In the prison, the same thing happened, where eventually he was put in charge of the other prisoners. Eventually, of course, he got out of prison by interpreting Pharaoh's dream and told him what was going to happen in the future. And after he was helping Pharaoh get through that very difficult time in Egypt, eventually the brothers came because that land was also facing famine, and Joseph met up with them. And he said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence, and I don't blame them. For all they knew, he had probably died years before, and here he is, the second in command in Egypt. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God created a meaning out of that situation. It was not you who sent me here, but God." When Joseph's brothers saw, so this happened after Joseph's father died, and again, the brothers were worried what Joseph's reaction was going to be. They didn't take his initial forgiveness seriously. They thought, well, he's just waiting until our father dies, and then he's really going to come after us. So this is later on in the story. Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. They said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph: "I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servant of the God your father." And Joseph was probably sad. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. He couldn't believe that they didn't take him seriously the first time around. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? you intended to harm me. He had a very realistic picture of what was going on. It wasn't like he was glossing things over and looking at things in an unrealistic way. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew that the brothers intended harm, but he said God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. What a man. What a story. This is the climax of this seminar. Thank you so much for being here. Shall I pray? Yeah, okay. Thank you again for being here. I hope it was a blessing to you. It's certainly a blessing for me to go through this material again. Let's pray together. Dear Lord Jesus, we thank you so much for the opportunity to be here together. We thank you so much for the Sabbath, a time at the end of every week that you give us to get rested up, to be restored for the next coming week. Lord, I ask you so that you help us to integrate all of these beliefs into our belief system. Help us to use everyone as ways of reducing our stress in our lives. So when we're facing difficult situations, I just ask that you bring these things back to our minds, help us to remember them, to filter the situation through them, and to come out on the other side with a more positive viewpoint and knowing how much you care and love us. Thank you so much for your care for everyone here. I ask you to give them traveling mercies on their way home today. In your name I pray, amen. Thank you again. Yeah.